Bank teller slaps the card away, blind to the storm brewing in the lobby. What seemed like disrespect to a stranger became Big Shaq's final transaction. Before closing time, $2.2 billion was gone, not stolen, but reclaimed. This wasn't a meltdown, it was a reckoning. When you humiliate power in plain sight, the system pays in silence. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The city bathed in the sharp golden light of a late afternoon sun, its shadows stretching long and lean between the gleaming high-rises of downtown. The world outside Monarch Bank moved with a restless hum, the usual foot traffic of polished business shoes and hurried commuters scuffing against the smooth stone pavement. Inside, however, the air was still, tense, almost thick with something unsaid. Camille Ross walked through the heavy glass doors, her steps measured but determined, each stride echoing softly on the polished marble floor. She was a woman who carried herself with quiet dignity, though the weight of the world pressed hard on her shoulders. Her work clothes were immaculate, a simple slate gray blouse and matching skirt, though her worn leather handbag, clutched a little too tightly, hinted at a life of careful budgeting and small sacrifices. Monarch Bank wasn't new to her. She had been coming here every other Friday for years, depositing her paycheck, paying bills, taking care of life's relentless demands. But today felt different. The lobby, cavernous and glittering with brass fixtures, felt colder than usual. Behind the long marble counter, bank tellers stood like sentinels, their faces composed but distant, their practiced smiles just thin enough to betray the brittle tension beneath. At the center of it all stood Harper Gaines, the senior teller whose precision in her work was only rivaled by her ability to make certain customers feel invisible. She eyed Camille the moment she stepped forward, her gaze flicking from the woman's face to her outstretched hand holding a simple bank card. There was a moment, an infinitesimal pause before Harper reached out. It was deliberate. It was calculated. And then in a swift, dismissive gesture she slapped the card from Camille's fingers. The sound of plastic against marble echoed faintly, just loud enough to draw a few curious glances from the waiting line. Camille's heart twisted with the sudden heat of humiliation, her face flushing deep crimson as she stooped quickly to retrieve the fallen card. The moment stretched, and in that silence a quiet undercurrent of something uglier began to ripple through the space. It wasn't just about the card, it was about the layers of quiet disrespect Camille had faced in this building before. The glances too long, the silence too deliberate, the paperwork delayed without explanation. Harper's smirk was barely perceptible, but it was there, curling at the corner of her mouth like a shadow, daring Camille to protest, to make a scene. Camille's fingers trembled as she held her card tightly. Her throat felt thick with unshed words, but she swallowed them down. She was too familiar with the way these stories usually played out, too familiar with the inevitable escalation, if she let her temper show. And so she straightened, nodded stiffly, and turned to leave. Up above, in the bank's private VIP lounge, a man watched the scene unfold. His name was Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq to some, just Shaq to most. But today he wasn't here as the larger-than-life basketball legend or the multimillionaire investor. Today he was here as a man who saw a story he'd seen too many times before. He leaned against the thick glass wall of the lounge, his massive frame almost a shadow against the city skyline. His voice, quiet but resolute in his own mind, narrated the unfolding events, as if speaking directly to an unseen audience. He'd grown up knowing what it felt like to be judged before you spoke, to have doors closed before you even knocked. His mother, Lucille, had taught him resilience, had shown him how to stand tall when the world tried to press him down. But standing here, watching Camille Ross be reduced to silence and humiliation, he felt something old and cold awaken in him. The Monarch Bank, a towering pillar of the city's financial elite, was no stranger to rumors. Shaq had heard whispers of policies that subtly favored some while burdening others, of procedures that could make life just a little harder for people like Camille. The bank's executives spoke of risk management and high-value clients, but the results always seemed to fall hardest on those who looked like him. He'd come here today for a routine meeting, to discuss investment strategies and community development initiatives, projects designed to uplift the very neighborhoods banks, like Monarch, seemed to forget. But now the meeting felt irrelevant. His mind was already racing ahead, calculating possibilities, measuring consequences. As Camille retreated from the counter, her steps shaky but resolute, Shaq turned away from the glass and moved toward the elevator. His thoughts were sharp, deliberate. He would not storm down to confront Harper. He would not make a scene. That wasn't his style, and it wouldn't change the narrative. No, he would act with the same quiet decisiveness that had made him a legend on and off the court. Outside, the sun dipped a little lower, casting long golden rays through the bank's front windows. Shadows stretched across the marble floor, twisting and curling like silent witnesses. Customers murmured uneasily, some averting their eyes, others glancing from Camille to Harper and back again, as if trying to decide whether to say something or let it pass. Shaq knew that too many people would let it pass. They always did. The weight of centuries of quiet injustice pressed down on his chest, but he inhaled deeply, steadying himself. This wasn't just about Camille. This was about every unseen slight, every quiet dismissal, every silent slap that went unchallenged because people feared to speak, or because they thought it wasn't their place. And so, as the elevator doors slid shut around him, enclosing him in cool silence, Shaq made his decision. Today would not be just another day at Monarch Bank. Today would be the day it all began. The sun cast a golden hue over the city, its rays filtering through the towering glass facade of Monarch Bank. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed, the kind of silence that clung to the walls of institutions built on old money and older prejudices. Camille Ross stepped into the lobby, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor. She clutched her worn leather handbag, the strap frayed from years of use, and approached the teller counter with a sense of purpose. Harper Gaines stood behind the counter, her posture rigid, eyes scanning Camille with a practiced indifference. Camille offered a polite smile, extending her bank card toward Harper. Without a word, Harper's hand moved swiftly, striking the card from Camille's grasp. It fell to the floor with a soft clatter, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. Camille's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she stooped to retrieve it. A murmur rippled through the line behind her. "Did you see that?" someone whispered. "Not the first time she's done that." Another voice replied. Camille straightened, her eyes meeting Harper's. The teller's expression remained impassive, as if nothing had happened. Camille's heart pounded in her chest, a mix of anger and humiliation swirling within her. Unbeknownst to the crowd, Shaquille O'Neal observed the scene from the bank's VIP lounge above. His towering frame was partially obscured by the tinted glass, but his eyes were fixed on the unfolding drama below. Memories of his own experiences with subtle discrimination flooded his mind. He recalled the times when his mother, Lucille, had been treated with similar disdain, the quiet indignities that left lasting scars. Camille turned away from the counter, her steps measured but unsteady. The whispers followed her, a chorus of sympathy and shared outrage. Shaq's jaw tightened as he watched her retreat. He had seen enough. The bank's reputation for subtle discrimination was no secret, but witnessing it firsthand stirred something deep within him. As Camille exited the bank, the lobby returned to its usual quietude. Harper resumed her duties, her demeanor unchanged, but the incident lingered in the air, a silent testament to the pervasive undercurrents of prejudice that still thrived in places of power. Shaq descended from the VIP lounge, his mind racing. He had built his fortune through hard work and resilience, but he had never forgotten the lessons of his youth. He knew that true change required more than just wealth. It demanded action. As he approached the teller counter, the staff straightened, their expressions shifting from indifference to apprehension. Without a word, Shaq handed a slip of paper to the bank manager, Royce Pendleton. The manager's eyes widened as he read the figure. $2 billion. Shaq's entire holdings with the bank. The room fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. "I'd like to withdraw my funds," Shaq said calmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had endured and overcome. Royce stammered, attempting to placate him, but Shaq raised a hand, silencing him. "No explanations, just process the transaction." The staff scrambled to comply, the usual procedures abandoned in the face of Shaq's resolve. As the paperwork was finalized, Shaq turned to leave, his steps echoing through the now silent lobby. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual energy, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred within the walls of Monarch Bank. Camille stood across the street, her eyes meeting Shaq's as he exited. A silent understanding passed between them, a shared recognition of the injustices they had both faced. Shaq offered a nod, a gesture of solidarity and support. In that moment, the foundations of Monarch Bank trembled, not from physical force, but from the quiet power of dignity and resolve. The incident would soon become a catalyst for change, a reminder that even the most entrenched institutions could be challenged by those who refused to remain silent. Shaquille O'Neal stood in the bank's elevator, the cool hum of its machinery masking the surge of thoughts racing through his mind. He wasn't just Big Shaq, the towering figure people cheered for on the court or the business magnates splashed across magazine covers. No. Right now, in this silent steel chamber, he was Shaquille O'Neal, the boy from Newark who had grown up under the quiet, unflinching gaze of his mother, Lucille. The boy who'd learned to read the room before speaking, who'd felt the sting of assumptions long before he could put words to the injustice. As the elevator descended, memories surfaced like bubbles from the depths, each one carrying a sharp edge. He could see his mother's face, calm and determined, as she navigated a grocery store clerk's dismissive tone, or a landlord's curt rebuff. He remembered the time she stood firm, back straight, voice low but unyielding, when a neighbor questioned their right to live in a certain part of town. "We're here, and we belong here," she'd said, her words sinking deep into his young heart. Now, standing with his reflection fractured against the gleaming elevator walls, he felt that same quiet fury simmer beneath his composed exterior. He thought of the reporters who'd once painted him as a simple giant, more brawn than brain, assuming his success was a fluke rather than the result of careful strategy and relentless discipline. He thought of the boardrooms where executives smiled politely, but kept their hands hovering just short of genuine respect. They saw the nickname, the public persona, but not the man. The elevator slowed to a halt, the doors sliding open with a hushed sigh. Shaq stepped out onto the marble floor of Monarch Bank's ground level. He didn't need to look toward the teller counters to know Harper Gaines was still there, her smirk hidden behind a veil of professionalism. He could feel the weight of the stares, the curiosity barely concealed behind whispered conversations. The scene earlier, the casual dismissal of Camille's presence, had left a mark on everyone who witnessed it, though most would choose to forget it by tomorrow. But Shaq couldn't forget. He wouldn't. He walked past the polished counters, his steps deliberate, his mind cataloging every detail, the way Harper's voice had dripped with condescension, the subtle tightening of the shoulders of nearby staff when they realized who was watching. They might assume he was here to close an account or complain quietly, to let the moment pass, but they didn't know the depth of his resolve, the years he'd spent turning slights into stepping stones, the discipline he'd honed not just on the basketball court but in life. He thought back to a day in his childhood, standing outside a corner store while his mother argued with the owner inside about a mispriced item. He'd felt the urge to intervene, to raise his voice, but Lucille had placed a calming hand on his shoulder and whispered, "There's a time for words, and there's a time for action. Know the difference." That lesson had stayed with him, had shaped the way he navigated a world that often tried to box him in. Now, as he moved through the bank's lobby, he let those words guide him. There was no need for a public confrontation, no value in theatrics that would be twisted and dismissed by those eager to paint him as just another angry man. No, his fury would remain silent but precise, aimed where it would hurt the most, at the foundation of the system that allowed Harper's casual cruelty to flourish. He paused near the exit, his gaze sweeping across the room. His mind ticked through plans like a master strategist, contacts in legal circles, allies in the media, financial moves that could send ripples through Monarch Bank's polished facade. He would act not just for Camille, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small in spaces like this. His silence was a weapon, sharp and controlled. Outside, the late afternoon sun had begun its descent, casting elongated shadows through the glass windows. Shaq's figure, tall and broad, was outlined against the shifting light. As he stepped out onto the street, the noise of the city wrapped around him, but it couldn't penetrate the focus that gripped him. This wasn't just about withdrawing billions, or making a statement. It was about disrupting a system that thrived on the quiet compliance of those it marginalized. As he stood at the curb, waiting for his driver, a flash of memory returned to him. A high school game where he'd been taunted by opposing fans, their words cruel and cutting. He'd played harder, stronger, not out of anger, but to prove to himself more than anyone that their words didn't define him. That same resolve coursed through him now, but it was no longer about proving his worth. It was about dismantling the quiet mechanisms of prejudice that people like Harper and institutions like Monarch Bank upheld. The driver pulled up, and Shaq climbed into the car, his mind already working through the next steps. He didn't look back at the bank, didn't need to. He knew the real confrontation was just beginning, and it would be waged not in shouts, but in calculated, deliberate moves. The fury within him remained silent, but it was no less potent. As the car merged into the steady stream of traffic, Shaq leaned back, his thoughts drifting for a moment to Lucille, her quiet strength a guiding force. He imagined her voice, calm and steady. Stand tall, son. Make your moves count. He wasn't just Big Shaq, he was the sum of every lesson, every slight, every moment of resilience that had brought him here. And now he would use that strength to challenge the very foundations of power that had tried to dismiss people like Camille. The sun dipped lower, its light now a muted gold. The city continued its ceaseless hum, unaware that a storm was brewing, silent and precise, and at its center stood Shaquille O'Neal, no longer just a man in a suit, but a force poised to shift the balance. The late afternoon sun cast elongated shadows across the polished floors of Monarch Bank, its golden rays filtering through the expansive glass facade. The bank's interior, usually a haven of hushed conversations, and the soft clatter of keyboards, now held a palpable tension. Employees moved with a heightened sense of awareness, their eyes darting toward the entrance, where Shaquille O'Neal stood, his towering frame a silhouette against the light. Shaq approached the teller counter with measured steps, his presence commanding yet devoid of aggression. The room seemed to hold its breath, as he reached into his jacket and produced a document, placing it gently on the counter. Harper Gaines, the teller who had earlier dismissed Camille Ross with such disdain, looked up, her expression shifting from practiced indifference to visible unease. "I'd like to make a withdrawal," Shaq stated calmly, his voice steady. Harper glanced at the document, her eyes widening as she processed the figure. $2 billion. The number seemed surreal, almost abstract, yet the intent was clear. This wasn't a routine transaction. It was a statement. "I'll need to speak with the branch manager," Harper stammered, her composure faltering. Within moments, Royce Pendleton emerged from his office, his tailored suit and polished demeanor exuding authority. He approached with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, extending a hand that Shaq chose not to shake. "Mr. O'Neal, what a surprise. How can we assist you today?" Royce inquired, his tone laced with forced cordiality. "I'm here to withdraw all my funds," Shaq replied, his gaze unwavering. Royce's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of concern. "That's a substantial amount. Perhaps we could discuss this in my office." "No need," Shaq responded. "I've made my decision." The room grew quieter, the usual background noise of the bank replaced by an almost oppressive silence. Employees exchanged glances, the gravity of the situation sinking in. "May I ask why?" Royce ventured, attempting to maintain control. Shaq leaned slightly forward, his voice low but firm. "I witnessed how one of your employees treated a valued customer today. That behavior reflects the culture of this institution, and I choose not to be a part of it." Royce's face reddened, a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. "I assure you, Mr. O'Neal, that incident doesn't represent our values. Actions speak louder than words," Shaq replied, his tone final. Realizing the futility of further persuasion, Royce signaled to Harper to begin the process. She hesitated, then turned to her computer, her fingers trembling slightly as she initiated the transaction. As the necessary paperwork was prepared, Shaq stood silently, his presence a stark contrast to the flurry of activity around him. The magnitude of his withdrawal sent ripples through the bank's hierarchy, prompting calls to higher management and frantic consultations. Outside, a small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual commotion. News of the event spread rapidly, whispers of Shaq's decisive action fueling conversations. Back inside, Royce returned with the finalized documents, his demeanor subdued. "Everything is in order, Mr. O'Neal. We respect your decision." Shaq nodded, taking the papers and turning to leave. As he walked toward the exit, he paused briefly, glancing back at the employees who had observed the entire exchange. "Remember," he said, his voice carrying through the lobby, "integrity isn't just about policies, it's about people." With that, he stepped out into the fading sunlight, leaving behind a bank forever changed by a quiet act of defiance. The city skyline, bathed in the deep orange of a sinking sun, seemed to stretch and blur as if hiding something just beyond its reach. From a penthouse window several blocks away, a figure stood in silent observation, his silhouette merging with the glass. Leighton Cross, known to the business world as a man of refinement and discretion, sipped from a cut-glass tumbler, his eyes fixed on Monarch Bank's towering presence. The smile playing at the corner of his mouth wasn't one of amusement. It was the cold, measured satisfaction of a predator watching his plan unfold. For months, Leighton had moved behind the scenes, weaving policies into Monarch Bank's framework, that were as elegant as they were sinister. His strategy wasn't born of overt power, but of precise, calculated shifts in procedure, ones that subtly isolated clients who didn't fit a certain profile. Shaquille O'Neal was never meant to see it coming. Through layers of red tape and deliberately delayed transactions, Leighton's intent was to destabilize the foundations of Shaq's empire, to choke off liquidity without drawing suspicion. But today's public withdrawal hadn't been part of his script. Leighton's thoughts drifted to the early days of his rivalry with Shaq. It hadn't been personal at first, just business. Yet over time resentment had festered. He'd watched as Shaq expanded his influence beyond sports into real estate, technology and philanthropy, weaving a network of partnerships that challenged the old guard's grip on power. Leighton's world was one where control was maintained, not through brute force but through invisible threads that ensnared the ambitious and the idealistic alike. Now standing with the city sprawled beneath him, Leighton's mind worked through the implications of today's events. Camille Ross was a minor piece in the puzzle, a pawn used to bait Shaq into reaction. Her history with Monarch Bank, specifically her attempts to expose internal corruption, had been noted, flagged and exploited. Harper Gaines, hand-picked and discreetly influenced through whispered incentives, had played her role perfectly, her casual cruelty designed to provoke but not to draw headlines. Yet Shaq had turned the entire game on its head. His calm withdrawal of $2.2 billion wasn't just a loss of assets for Monarch Bank. It was a strategic blow aimed at the heart of Leighton's scheme. The bank's executives, already jittery under the weight of internal audits, would now be scrambling, their confidence eroded by the public nature of the incident. The whispers Leighton had so carefully cultivated were now accompanied by shouts, drawing media attention and government scrutiny. Still, Leighton wasn't a man easily rattled. He leaned back against the cool glass, the city lights flickering like embers below. This wasn't the endgame. It was merely a complication. His network extended far beyond Monarch Bank, threading into rival corporations, political circles, and regulatory bodies. One move from Shaq, even one as dramatic as this, wasn't enough to topple the entire structure. But as he considered his next steps, a subtle unease crept into his thoughts. There had been whispers, unconfirmed but persistent, about Shaq's recent alliances, a quiet partnership with a disruptive tech firm, a confidential merger with a philanthropic consortium known for legal precision and media savvy. These weren't typical moves for a man content with public success. They were the steps of someone preparing for a deeper play. Leighton's hand tightened around the glass, the amber liquid inside trembling with the force of his grip. Could it be that Shaq had seen the threads all along, that the withdrawal was not an impulsive reaction, but a calculated strike? Suspense tightened like a noose around his thoughts, the familiar comfort of control slipping just out of reach. Across the city, Shaq sat in the back of a sleek black SUV, his face calm, his thoughts razor-sharp. The driver navigated the evening traffic with practiced ease, but Shaq's focus was elsewhere. He considered Leighton's network, the layers of influence that had subtly worked against him. It wasn't just about money, it was about power, about control, about who dictated the terms of engagement, in a world that still underestimated men who looked like him. The deeper twist was already in motion. For months, Shaq had been building alliances under the radar, partnerships that would expose not just Monarch Bank's discriminatory practices, but the entire web of corporate manipulation that Leighton represented. Camille's incident, though deeply personal, had served as a public catalyst, a spark designed to ignite a much larger fire. Leighton's smile faded as the realization settled, the weight of miscalculation pressing against his composure. The shadows he had relied upon for concealment were thinning, pierced by the quiet resilience of a man who had learned long ago that real strength lay not in intimidation but in persistence and precision. As night descended over the city, Leighton Cross remained at his window, the glass no longer offering comfort, but reflecting back his own uncertainty. His plans, once seamless and unchallenged, were now unraveling, not with a bang, but with the steady, unyielding force of a man determined to reclaim his narrative. The stage was set, the players in motion, and the next move belonged not to the predator, but to the man who had always been underestimated, the man who had learned the art of silent fury. The city's evening light filtered through narrow alleyways, catching the edges of Camille Ross's figure as she walked away from Monarch Bank. The humiliation she'd endured hours earlier clung to her like the sticky heat rising from the asphalt, but there was something else beneath it, a quiet, simmering resolve. Camille wasn't just a victim of a dismissive bank teller's prejudice or the whispers of a watching crowd. She was a woman with a past most couldn't imagine, a story hidden behind years of carefully folded silence. Long before Shaquille O'Neal's withdrawal shook the bank's foundations, Camille had once been part of its inner machinery. As a junior compliance officer, she'd been young and eager, driven by the belief that integrity could thrive even in towering institutions with walls made of glass and steel. But it didn't take long for her to see through the thin veneer of respectability. Quiet discrepancies in the paperwork, transactions that seemed suspiciously delayed or rerouted, clients with profiles that didn't match the red flags they triggered. It was all there, woven into the daily operations like a sickness that no one dared name aloud. Camille had spent long nights poring over documents, her eyes burning from the glow of spreadsheets, her heart sinking with each confirmation of her suspicions. Monarch Bank wasn't just careless, it was complicit. Discriminatory practices weren't a matter of accidental oversight, but deliberate strategy. She had compiled evidence, built a case, and finally approached her supervisor, only to be met with thinly veiled warnings. She was told to back down, reminded of her position, her responsibilities, and the consequences of disrupting the bank's operations. The warnings hadn't stopped her. Camille reached out to regulatory bodies, her voice shaking but her words clear. She submitted anonymous tips, planted seeds of doubt in the minds of journalists she trusted. But each attempt was met with silence or quiet dismissal. The bank's connections ran deeper than she'd imagined, and soon her efforts to expose the truth left her marked. Without explicit retribution, the bank made her life increasingly difficult, assigning her to tasks beneath her qualifications, freezing her professional development, and finally letting her go under the pretense of downsizing. She'd left Monarch Bank a shell of her former self, her reputation quietly tarnished by unspoken rumors of insubordination. It wasn't long before her name was quietly blacklisted in financial circles. Her attempts to find new work met with polite rejections and unreturned calls. Years passed, but the sting of betrayal never left her. The bank hadn't just silenced her voice, it had painted her as a problem to be avoided. When she walked into Monarch Bank that morning, she hadn't intended to draw attention. Her visit was routine, the remnants of old ties she couldn't quite sever. But the moment Harper Gaines slapped her card away, Camille realized something more sinister had been at play. This wasn't just casual cruelty, it was calculated. Her card, flagged years ago, under quiet orders, wasn't just a reminder of her past employment. It was a mark of her defiance, a quiet signal to staff that she wasn't to be served, that her presence wasn't welcome. Above, in the bank's VIP lounge, Shaq had seen it happen, but he hadn't known the full weight of the story. Not yet. His decision to withdraw his holdings hadn't been purely reactionary. There was something in Camille's posture, in the quiet dignity with which she'd retrieved her fallen card and walked away, that spoke volumes. He sensed a story deeper than the surface insult, a history layered with quiet resistance. Shaq's contacts had begun pulling threads as soon as he left the bank. Confidential files whispered of Camille's whistleblower attempts, her name buried under layers of sanitized records. His legal advisors traced the connections. Shell corporations linked to Leighton Cross, policies drafted with calculated precision to exclude and exploit, and a pattern of retaliation aimed at those who dared to challenge the status quo. Camille wasn't just a victim of a rude teller's whim. She was a symbol of the quiet war being waged within Monarch Bank's pristine walls. As Camille made her way home that evening, she moved with a deliberate grace that belied the storm brewing around her. Her phone buzzed quietly, a message from an unknown number blinking on the screen. "Watch the news tonight. You're not alone." Her heart skipped a beat, recognition dawning in the pit of her stomach. She wasn't alone in this fight. Not anymore. By the time the city's lights flickered on, casting shimmering reflections in rain-slicked streets, the news had broken. Headlines flashed with images of Shaq leaving Monarch Bank, his face calm, his voice measured as he explained his decision. But in the shadows of those headlines, whispers of Camille's past surfaced, her name finally linked to the corruption she had tried to expose. The weight of years lifted from her shoulders as she realized the game had changed. Leighton Cross's subtle machinations were now dragged into the light, his intricate web unraveling thread by thread. The silence that had once been her prison was now a weapon, her story part of a larger narrative that couldn't be ignored. Camille sat by her window, watching the city hum with the energy of late-night commuters and neon lights. Her hands, once trembling with fear, were now steady with resolve. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in years, she felt a shift. The quiet voice that had once whispered warnings now spoke with conviction. She wasn't just a casualty of corporate greed, she was a survivor, warrior in a battle that was finally irrevocably hers to win. The hush inside Monarch Bank was broken only by the frantic shuffling of papers and the muted clatter of keyboards. Behind the thick glass of his office, Royce Pendleton stood rigid, his jaw clenched as he watched Shaquille O'Neal's departure from the corner of his eye. The news was already spreading outside the bank's walls, whispers morphing into rumors, rumors into a brewing storm. The withdrawal of $2.2 billion wasn't just a blow to the institution's financial stability. It was a declaration of war on the carefully maintained image Royce had spent years curating. Royce turned back to his desk, his hand trembling slightly, as he reached for his phone. He punched in a private number, waiting through a few rings before a voice answered. "Initiate the freeze," he said without preamble, his voice low and sharp. "I want the O'Neal accounts frozen immediately. Any transfers out of Monarch flagged and delayed. Find a clause, a technicality, anything to stall this." On the other end, the legal counsel responded with a curt affirmation. Royce exhaled slowly, feeling a twisted sense of relief. The law was a labyrinth, full of procedural choke points, and he knew how to exploit its shadows. He'd stalled clients before, hidden behind the camouflage of legal jargon and regulatory red tape. Shaq might have made a public statement, but Royce still held the cards, or so he thought. What Royce hadn't anticipated was Shaq's foresight. Outside, just beyond the bank's revolving doors, a sleek black sedan idled. Inside, Shaq sat calmly, the subtle hum of the engine beneath his feet. His gaze distant but sharp, his legal team seasoned, discreet, and armed with a thorough understanding of financial warfare stood ready. Months before today, they had combed through Monarch's policies, prepared airtight documentation, and lined up media contacts to ensure no maneuver went unnoticed. The instant Royce's call went through, a flurry of coordinated actions ignited. Shaq's attorneys filed preemptive motions in federal court, challenging any attempt at freezing the accounts and securing emergency injunctions. The bank's own compliance department, already rattled by Camille Ross's emerging story and the media scrutiny from Shaq's withdrawal, found itself buried under a mountain of simultaneous requests for records and statements. The tide Royce thought he controlled was shifting beneath his feet. Back in his office, Royce's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from his assistant. "We're being served," she said, her voice tight with strain. He felt a cold sweat bead at his temple as he snatched the papers delivered to his desk. The legal language was precise and unforgiving, challenging the bank's actions, exposing loopholes in Monarch's internal controls, and most damning of all, referencing precedents of discriminatory practices dating back years. He flipped through the pages, his fingers trembling. Shaq hadn't just come prepared, he'd come armed with a strategy that reached deeper and cut sharper than Royce had imagined. The bank's legal team was already on a conference call, voices raised in anxious counter-arguments, but the urgency in their tone betrayed their panic. The lobby, once a temple of quiet authority, was now a battleground of whispered conversations and stolen glances. Employees shuffled nervously, aware that the narrative was shifting from a private corporate maneuver to a very public unraveling. Shaq's withdrawal was no longer just a financial move. It had become a symbol of resistance, an unmasking of the silent mechanisms that protected institutions like Monarch from scrutiny. Royce's mind raced, searching for an escape route. He imagined calling in favors, leaning on old connections, but the realization gnawed at him. Shaq's move had been too swift, too clean. The legal filings had been timed to catch the bank off balance, to force them into a defensive position with little room to maneuver. Even the media was circling, hungry for a story of corporate downfall, their cameras likely already trained on the bank's stately entrance. In his office, Royce gripped the edge of his desk, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. For years he had navigated the gray spaces of corporate policy, confident in his ability to deflect, delay, and ultimately outlast any challenge. But now, faced with the precision of Shaq's strategy and the gathering storm of public scrutiny, he felt his power slipping away like water through clenched fists. Outside, Shaq remained composed, his thoughts steady. He'd spent years watching men like Royce maneuver behind polished desks, hiding their machinations behind layers of bureaucracy and plausible deniability. But he'd also learned the value of patience, of planning moves 3 steps ahead. This wasn't just about withdrawing his funds. It was about pulling back the curtain, exposing the machinery of quiet discrimination that people like Camille Ross had fought against in isolation for too long. Royce's last-ditch gambit was crumbling under the weight of its own duplicity. The legal walls he'd hidden behind were now transparent, the shadows he'd relied upon pierced by a relentless light. The calls coming in weren't offers of support, but demands for explanations, each one tightening the noose around his carefully curated reputation. As the clock ticked closer to closing time, Royce realized the truth he'd tried so hard to avoid. His power wasn't crumbling because of Shaq's withdrawal. It was crumbling because the foundation it stood upon had always been rotten, and today the cracks had finally split wide open. The sun had sunk behind the city's tallest towers, leaving Monarch Bank bathed in the glow of streetlights and the bright glaring beams of camera crews. The air was thick with anticipation, a charged hum of murmured speculations and hurried conversation. Outside the bank's grand entrance, a makeshift podium had been set up, its microphone standing solitary against the coming storm. The crowd was gathering, drawn by the ripple of a story too powerful to ignore. Camille Ross stood beside Shaquille O'Neal, her posture steady despite the weight of every eye fixed upon her. She was no longer the woman whose card had been slapped away in humiliation. No. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, her gaze direct, her hands were clasped loosely at her waist, her jaw set, the subtle tremble of her breath betraying the immense pressure of the moment. But beside her, Shaq's silent presence lent her an unspoken strength. Shaq stepped forward, the crowd's murmur falling to a hush. His voice cut through the night, deep and deliberate. "You've all seen what happened here," he began, his words carrying the gravity of years spent navigating systems designed to push people like him to the margins. But what you don't see, what's hidden behind polished walls and carefully worded policies, is the real story. This isn't just about a card being slapped away. It's about a system built to exclude, to diminish, to silence. He turned slightly, nodding toward Camille. "This woman standing with me today tried to expose the truth long before I ever stepped foot in this building. She brought evidence. She raised her voice, and she was dismissed, her livelihood threatened. And when the system failed her, it tried to erase her completely. But she didn't disappear. She didn't back down. And today, she stands here, not as a victim but as a witness to the truth." The cameras clicked rapidly, their flashes capturing every angle, every subtle shift of expression. The reporters leaned in, their microphones extended, hungry for sound bites, for the salacious details that would make headlines. But Shaq wasn't offering spectacle. He was delivering a reckoning. "I've known what discrimination feels like since I was a boy," he continued, his voice tightening with restrained emotion. "I've seen it in the way doors are closed, in the way hands are withdrawn, in the way voices are ignored. And I've watched it thrive in places like this bank, where power hides behind policies, and money is used as a shield against accountability. But today that shield is gone. Today the truth steps into the light." The suspense in the air thickened, the crowd pressing closer, drawn by the sheer force of Shaq's words. Behind them, the illuminated bank logo seemed almost to flicker, as if the building itself were shrinking under the weight of his accusation. A reporter called out, her voice sharp. "Mr. O'Neal, are you suggesting Monarch Bank engaged in systemic racism?" Shaq met her gaze squarely. "I'm not suggesting it. I'm saying it plain and clear. The evidence is there. The practices are documented. And the experiences of people like Camille prove it beyond doubt. This isn't about one incident. It's about a pattern, a culture of exclusion that has gone unchallenged for too long." The murmurs intensified, a wave of tension rippling through the gathered crowd. From the shadows beyond the cameras, Leighton Cross watched, his face a mask of carefully schooled neutrality. But his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. He had woven his web of influence through careful alliances and quiet threats, confident that no one would dare pull the threads. Yet now, with Shaq's words echoing across the city, the web was unraveling. As Shaq continued, his voice sharpened with purpose. "But let's not stop at this bank. Let's talk about the man behind the curtain. Leighton Cross, the same man whose fingerprints are all over the policies that target people like Camille, whose name is linked to the very foundations of this discriminatory system. He thought he could stay in the shadows, pulling strings while the rest of us danced to his tune. But no more. His influence, his schemes, they're coming to light." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reporters scrambled to verify Shaq's claims, their phones buzzing with alerts, their feeds filling with fragments of revelations. Leighton's name, once uttered only in whispers, was now being broadcast on every major network, linked to scandals stretching far beyond Monarch Bank, allegations of insider trading, connections to predatory lending practices, even covert political donations tied to regulatory rollbacks. Leighton's mask cracked, his lips tightening as he stepped back into the shadows, realizing the depth of exposure he now faced. His carefully maintained empire was crumbling, not from a direct assault, but from the steady, unyielding force of truth brought into the open. Camille lifted her chin, her voice quiet but resolute, as she finally spoke. I tried to tell this story once, and I was silenced. But thanks to Mr. O'Neal, the story's being told now, and I won't be silent anymore. The cameras captured her words, her image, no longer the woman humiliated in a bank lobby, but a symbol of resilience, of the quiet strength that refuses to be extinguished. The media frenzy shifted, no longer seeking scandal, but revelation. The narrative had changed, and with it, the power dynamics that had once seemed immutable. Shaq concluded, his voice resonant. This isn't just about me, or Camille, or Monarch Bank. It's about all of us, about demanding accountability, about standing up when silence has been the norm for too long. The systems built to exclude us don't stand a chance when we stand together, and we're just getting started. As the crowd erupted into a mix of applause, exclamations, and hurried questions, Shaq and Camille stood united, the towering figure of a man who refused to be underestimated, and the unwavering woman who had dared to speak truth to power. Behind them, Monarch Bank loomed, its pristine facade now marked by the undeniable cracks of exposure. The early dawn light softened the edges of the city's skyline, painting Monarch Bank's towering presence with a pale, almost fragile glow. The building, once a fortress of confidence and quiet exclusion, now stood hushed and hollow, its glass facade reflecting not power but vulnerability. Inside, the usual click of polished shoes against marble floors was absent, replaced by the hushed shuffle of staff gathering personal belongings under the watchful eyes of federal agents. The news had broken just hours earlier. The bank was under emergency shutdown, its operations suspended indefinitely pending investigation. Shaquille O'Neal's voice, usually deep and resonant with charisma, now carried a reflective tone as he narrated, his thoughts unfolding like a measured soliloquy. Justice, he murmured, isn't always loud or triumphant. It's not a trophy to hold high or a number to tally. It's in the quiet moments when a system built to exclude and silence finally faces its reckoning. He stood by a floor-to-ceiling window in a conference room far removed from the chaos unfolding at Monarch Bank. The sun's gentle rays illuminated his face, revealing not the triumph of a victor, but the gravity of a man who knew that this victory, however impactful, was but a ripple in a vast ocean of injustice. His thoughts lingered on Camille Ross, whose quiet bravery had catalyzed this reckoning. Camille's world, too, had shifted. Offers of new opportunities arrived with cautious admiration, each one acknowledging her integrity, her resilience. Yet she approached them with tempered grace, knowing that no offer could erase the years of silence, the weight of being dismissed and marginalized. In a modest apartment filled with sunlight and scattered papers, she sat at her small kitchen table, sifting through letters of apology and invitations for interview. A soft smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, but it wasn't triumph. It was a recognition that her voice, once smothered, now resonated with clarity. Leighton Cross, the architect of quiet corruption, found himself ensnared, not by public outrage alone, but by the cold precision of federal investigation. His name, once spoken in hushed tones within boardrooms, now echoed through headlines detailing financial malpractice, discriminatory practices, and political entanglements. His empire, meticulously built on invisible threads of influence, was unraveling. Yet even as agents pieced together evidence, Shaq knew that true justice for the harm Leighton had wrought couldn't be measured by indictments alone. Shaq's voice softened, almost introspective. This isn't just about a corrupt banker or a broken institution. It's about the small, deliberate choices, the moments when someone decides to look away or speak up, to comply or resist. It's about knowing that change isn't a wave that sweeps away the old, but a slow, relentless tide that reshapes the shore. He thought of his mother, Lucille, her quiet strength anchoring him through every challenge. Her lessons echoed in his mind, reminders that standing tall wasn't about spectacle, but about integrity. He imagined her watching from afar, her approval not in applause but in the silent nod of someone who knew the true cost of resilience. The media, once clamoring for soundbites, shifted their focus. The story had evolved from a sensational incident into a deeper examination of systemic failures. Camille's face appeared not as a footnote, but as a symbol of quiet courage. Shaq's name, too, was now tied to more than just wealth and fame. It was a testament to strategic resistance, to the power of standing firm against forces that thrived on silence and complicity. In boardrooms across the city, executives whispered about contingency plans, about compliance reviews, about the need for a public reset. Monarch Bank's emergency shutdown sent ripples through the financial sector, a reminder that institutions built on exclusion and quiet corruption were no longer untouchable. Yet Shaq's narration was clear-eyed. "This isn't an ending," he mused. "It's a beginning, a shift in the narrative. But we can't pretend that one victory changes the weight of history. It takes more than one man's withdrawal, or one woman's courage to dismantle what's been built over centuries." Camille, seated at her kitchen table, felt the truth of his words resonate deep within her. She glanced at a small framed photo of her younger self, a reminder of the idealism that once fueled her fight against Monarch Bank's injustices. Now, with the world finally listening, she felt the weight of responsibility to keep the momentum alive, to ensure that the light Shaq had shone on the corruption didn't fade into another forgotten headline. Shaq's gaze turned toward the city beyond the window, its buildings bathed in soft gold. "The money I withdrew, the statements I made, it was never about the numbers." His voice continued, measured and thoughtful. "It was about making a crack in the wall, showing others that the wall isn't invincible. It was about telling those who've been silenced that their stories matter, that their resilience is seen." As the sun rose higher, painting the city in brighter hues, Shaq felt the weight of the day's victory settle not as a triumph but as a responsibility. He wasn't gloating, nor was he content. He knew that for every Monarch Bank that fell, others stood waiting, fortified by their own systems of exclusion. But he also knew that each act of resistance, however small, sent ripples through those walls. He turned away from the window, his steps slow but deliberate. "This fight isn't over," he said quietly. "But today, we've shown that silence isn't the only option. That standing together, speaking truth, can start to shift the ground beneath our feet. And that, more than money or headlines, is what justice looks like." In the soft amber glow of dawn, the familiar streets of Shaquille O'Neal's childhood neighborhood stretched quietly before him. The cracked sidewalks and faded murals whispered stories of resilience, of communities that had endured against the quiet crush of systemic neglect. Here, in the very heart of where his story began, a new chapter was unfolding. Lucille's house of hope stood proud where an abandoned lot once sagged with the weight of forgotten promises. Its brick facade was sturdy and clean, the windows bright with sunlight, the sign above the door etched with the name of the woman whose quiet strength had shaped Shaq's path. Shaq's voice narrated with a steady, thoughtful cadence, the tone of a man not basking in triumph, but reflecting on the layered complexities of justice. "This isn't just a building," he said, standing at the threshold, his broad frame casting a long shadow across the neatly paved entryway. "It's a symbol, a reminder that real change doesn't happen in boardrooms or headlines alone. It begins where stories are born, where communities breathe resilience into cracked pavement and faded paint." Inside, children's laughter echoed through the newly painted halls, mingling with the rhythmic tap of basketballs on polished floors. Volunteers organized books in a sunlit library, the scent of fresh paint and possibility lingering in the air. Here, in this modest but determined space, seeds of hope took root. Programs offered mentorship, education, financial literacy, and wellness initiatives, tools that Shaq knew were vital not just to survival, but to empowerment. His narration paused for a moment, the weight of memory pressing softly against the present. He thought of Lucille, her quiet dignity carrying them through lean years, her voice a steady compass guiding him through the maze of prejudice and assumption. He imagined her standing here, watching children chase dreams down hallways she'd never seen but always believed in. Her legacy wasn't just maternal, it was revolutionary, a testament to the power of resilience born from love and unwavering belief. Outside, the streets hummed with life, neighbors pausing to take in the sight of the new community center, their faces reflecting cautious hope. Reporters lingered at the periphery, their cameras poised but respectful, their lenses capturing not a spectacle, but a woman named Camille Ross stood among them, her arms crossed over her chest, a quiet smile playing at her lips. She wasn't here for publicity. She was here because this center, this tangible echo of Shaq's stand against injustice, was proof that speaking out could lead to real, grounded change. Shaq's voice returned, lower now, almost confiding. "One corrupt system may fall, but others wait in the shadows. They adapt, they shift, they find new ways to exclude, to diminish. That's why this isn't the end." It's a beginning. A reminder that standing up, standing together, isn't a one-time act. It's a commitment, a promise we make to each other, to the generations that follow. The suspense wasn't gone, but transformed. It wasn't the sharp edge of conflict, but the quiet hum of vigilance, the understanding that while a battle had been won, the war for justice continued in boardrooms, in classrooms, in everyday interactions where power could either uplift or oppress. Shaq's narration embraced this truth, offering not a resolution but a challenge. As he walked through the halls of Lucille's House of Hope, his steps deliberate and calm, he greeted volunteers by name, pausing to listen as children shared their dreams. His towering presence wasn't intimidating but reassuring, a living reminder that strength could be gentle, that power could be used not to dominate but to protect and nurture. He stopped in front of a mural, an image of Lucille herself painted with vibrant strokes that captured her warmth and fortitude. Shaq's gaze lingered there, his voice soft. "Mom, we did this. But it's not just for me, it's for everyone who's ever been told to wait, to stay silent, to accept less than they deserve. It's for every kid who dreams of more, for every voice that's been dismissed. It's a start." Outside, the sky brightened as the sun climbed higher, the shadows retreating but never fully disappearing. The city continued its rhythm, its streets alive with possibility and challenge. Shaq stepped into the light, his silhouette framed against the rising sun. His final words resonated with quiet determination. "The fight's not over, but together, we'll keep pushing, keep standing, keep building, until every voice is heard, until every story matters." The crowd outside the community center stirred, their murmurs blending into a rising swell of applause and conversation. Cameras captured the moment, but the true legacy was etched not in footage but in the hearts of those who stood witness. The story of Big Shaq, the man, not just the icon, was now part of a larger narrative of resilience, solidarity, and hope. And as the sun rose over the city, it carried the promise of more stories to come, of futures yet to be written. This story isn't just a headline, it's a call to shake the ground beneath injustice. Stand tall, ask the hard questions, and make your voice a force for truth. Be part of the movement rewriting what power really looks like. Let's push the line forward, together.